I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary that any right-minded thinking parent should believe that it would have been an alternative to bring those children down here.
Princess Anne, the most private royal, stood up in court and said the one thing no one expected.
And I don't think either of those two would have been able to cope. They'd been anywhere else. And that was the only good thing that happened, was that they were there.
Her words stopped the room cold and brought King Charles to tears. What did she reveal about Queen Elizabeth's final wishes? And why could it change the future of the monarchy forever? It was a moment no one inside the royal courtroom saw coming. Princess Anne, known for her lifelong dedication to duty and her famously private nature, stepped forward and did something entirely unexpected. She spoke from the heart. The room, filled with legal teams, senior members of the royal family, and a silent press gallery, had been prepared for a routine legal review of the Queen's estate documents. What they got instead was an emotional revelation that brought the proceedings to a standstill and left even King Charles visibly shaken. As Princess Anne made her way to the stand, observers noted how composed she appeared. She held her head high, as she always does, her expression calm but noticeably pale. There was a sense of formality in the air, the kind that usually surrounds royal appearances. But those who know Anne well could see that this time was different. This wasn't about public duty. It was personal. The court session had been called to review a selection of Queen Elizabeth II's private estate materials. These were not state papers or official records. Rather, they were handwritten notes, sealed letters, and personal reflections that had remained private throughout the Queen's reign and even after her passing. For decades, they were stored under tight security, seen only by a handful of trusted palace staff and legal advisors. But a recent legal challenge, focusing on the potential public implications of some parts of the Queen's private will, brought those documents into a more public legal setting. What happened next wasn't just unexpected, it was historic. As Anne began to speak, her voice was quiet, almost fragile. But the weight of her words cut through the silence. She wasn't reading from a prepared statement. Instead, she began to reflect on her mother's private thoughts, offering insights that had never before been shared publicly. And then, in a moment that would become the emotional centerpiece of the day, she recalled something Queen Elizabeth had once told her during a quiet conversation years ago. "I remember something my mother told me," Anne said, pausing as her eyes welled with tears. "The crown must pass through William, not just by birth, but by heart." The courtroom froze. You could hear a pin drop. For several seconds, no one moved. The press gallery held its breath, unsure whether they'd just heard what they thought they did. All eyes turned to King Charles, seated just a few feet away. At first, he didn't react. Then, with the slow lift of one hand, he wiped a tear from his cheek. It was subtle, but it was too late. The moment had already been captured by the cameras. The king had cried. Princess Anne didn't stay at the stand for long. Once her statement was complete, she stepped down quietly and returned to her seat. But the silence that followed spoke louder than any formal announcement. What she had just shared wasn't simply a family anecdote. It was, in effect, a direct message from Queen Elizabeth herself, passed on by her daughter in a courtroom setting that few could have predicted would become so emotionally charged. This moment quickly raised new questions. Why now? Why would Anne, someone who's famously guarded and typically avoids public commentary on family matters, choose this specific time and place to speak up? The answer, it seems, lies in the documents at the center of the hearing. The Queen's sealed letters, often referred to inside palace circles as the Windsor letters, are said to contain her most personal reflections on the state of the royal family, her children, and the long-term future of the monarchy. Though not much is officially confirmed, reports from journalists with ties to royal insiders suggest that these letters were deeply thoughtful and, in some cases, surprisingly candid. One legal expert connected to the case suggested that the Queen had left behind guidance, informal but deeply considered, on what she believed would help ensure the stability of the monarchy going forward. These weren't instructions written for a council of advisors or constitutional experts. They were private thoughts, possibly intended to be shared with her family at a time of transition. And that time, it seems, has come. Among the more surprising suggestions from early reports is the idea that Queen Elizabeth may have quietly preferred a path forward that didn't necessarily follow the traditional order of succession in spirit, even if not in law. Her affection and support for William has long been noted by royal observers, but the idea that she believed the crown should be earned not just by birthright, but by character, by heart, strikes at the core of modern debates surrounding the royal family's future. For Princess Anne, whose loyalty to the monarchy is unquestioned, speaking up in court was likely not a decision made lightly. Those close to her describe her as someone who values tradition and privacy above all else. But on this occasion, it appears that the content of the Queen's documents and the emotional memory they stirred pushed Anne to act differently. According to several sources present at the court, Anne also made a brief remark to a court official before taking the stand. "The public has a right to understand what the monarchy truly stands for," she reportedly said. That comment, simple as it is, marks a significant shift in tone from someone who has rarely, if ever, questioned the royal family's approach in public. In context, it's hard to overstate the significance of what happened. For decades, the monarchy has been defined by restraint. Even during times of intense public scrutiny, such as following Princess Diana's death, or during the more recent tensions surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the family has mostly adhered to the motto of never complain, never explain. Yet here was Princess Anne, standing in a courtroom, not only revealing personal memories, but also publicly delivering her mother's wishes in front of the king, legal teams, and press. While the statement didn't call for any formal change to the line of succession, its meaning was clear. This was about more than legal procedure. It was about legacy, what kind of leadership the monarchy needs in the 21st century, and who is best suited to carry it forward. Observers noted how the entire atmosphere in the courtroom shifted after Anne's statement. There was no applause, of course, no emotional outbursts, just a quiet, weighty stillness that lingered long after she sat back down. Some said it felt like a turning point. Others described it as a long overdue reckoning, one that might have only been possible now that Queen Elizabeth is no longer alive. For King Charles, the emotional impact appeared immediate. His whispered remark to Camilla, "She never told me that," was picked up by several lip readers reviewing court footage. It was said not in anger, but in sorrow, a sense perhaps of realizing something too late, that the monarch he had waited his entire life to succeed may have seen things differently than he had believed. What happens next is unclear. The court proceedings are expected to continue, and legal experts will sort through the details of what can and cannot be made public from the Queen's estate. But what's already been made public, Anne's emotional recollection, her decision to speak, and the King's visible reaction, may have already shifted the narrative around the monarchy's future. For decades, Anne has been known as the quiet engine of the monarchy. She rarely speaks out, and almost never involves herself in any form of public family dispute. Her work is consistent, her presence dependable, and her reputation as a no-nonsense royal is well-earned. But in that courtroom, something shifted. For the first time, she stepped beyond the role of silent support and took a public stance that, while carefully worded, pointed to deeper truths that may have been building inside her for years. One key to understanding Anne's decision may lie in a relationship the public never fully understood, her connection with Diana. On the surface, they couldn't have seemed more different. Anne was reserved, traditional, and preferred to work quietly behind the scenes. Diana was expressive, modern, and became one of the most photographed women in the world. But according to those who knew them both, there was more beneath the surface than the media ever captured. Anne has said privately, according to former palace aides, that people assumed they didn't get along simply because they rarely appeared close in public. But the truth, she explained, was that they shared something unique, a deep mutual understanding of what it meant to live under the crushing expectations of the royal institution. Both women were often outsiders in their own ways. Both were expected to conform. And both, in their own way, struggled with the limits that came with being a woman in the royal family. Their bond, while never publicly celebrated, was reportedly built on quiet acts of support. Anne didn't express her emotions openly, but when Diana was going through her most difficult times, especially during the breakdown of her marriage, Anne was said to be one of the few who checked in regularly, not through flashy gestures or headlines, but through private calls, small moments of kindness, and silent solidarity. When Diana passed away, Anne reportedly wore a bracelet Diana had once given her, hidden under the sleeve of her coat during the funeral. It wasn't something she pointed out. She didn't need to. For her, actions always spoke louder than words. So when Anne stood in court and recalled her mother's private hope that William would be the one to carry the crown forward, it wasn't just a message from Queen Elizabeth. It was a subtle echo of Diana's own wishes. For years, Diana had said she hoped her son would be a different kind of royal. Someone who led with empathy, who listened, who understood people not as subjects, but as individuals. Anne's statement in court may not have been planned as a tribute to Diana, but to those who listened carefully, it felt like one. Observers have since pointed out that Anne's words seemed to validate not just her mother's thoughts, but also Diana's. In doing so, she bridged two legacies, one shaped by tradition and longevity, the other by vulnerability and emotional openness. It was a rare moment of unity between the past and the present, spoken not in anger, but in measured reflection. But for all the attention on Diana and William, Anne's statement also had a more immediate impact, one that was impossible to ignore. King Charles, seated just feet away, was visibly emotional. When he was overheard whispering to Camilla that, "She never told me that," it wasn't just about surprise. It may have been the beginning of something more personal, a recognition that there were parts of his own mother's heart he had never fully known. The relationship between Anne and Charles has always been complicated. They were born just 2 years apart and raised in the same palaces, under the same set of expectations. But from an early age, their personalities took them in very different directions. Charles was introspective, sensitive, and drawn to philosophy and reform. Anne was pragmatic, focused, and results-driven. He preferred discussion. She preferred action. As children, they were often photographed together, attending events or standing beside their parents during royal engagements. But behind the scenes, insiders say they were never particularly close. The structure of royal life didn't allow for much personal bonding. Their schedules were packed. Their lives were highly managed. Even in their own home, there were layers of formality that shaped every interaction. By the time they became adults, those differences had only deepened. Charles leaned heavily on Camilla for support. Anne relied on herself. While Charles spent much of his time advocating for causes and reimagining the monarchy's role, Anne kept working. She traveled the world, opened hospitals, met with charities, often without fanfare or press coverage. In many ways, they represented two ends of the royal spectrum, the philosopher king and the working royal. Their mother, Queen Elizabeth, spent years managing this balance. According to former palace staff, she was often the one who helped smooth over differences between them, not with dramatic interventions, but with quiet guidance. She understood that her children had grown into very different people and tried to find ways to keep them aligned under the shared mission of service. But with the Queen gone, that balance appears to have shifted. In court, Anne's calm but deeply personal words weren't just a reflection of her own beliefs. They were also a moment of truth between siblings. For some, it felt like a reckoning years in the making. For others, it was a quiet confrontation, one that carried the weight of decades of unsaid things. It's important to note that Anne didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't criticize her brother directly. But by sharing a private memory of their mother, one that Charles hadn't heard before, she changed the dynamic. She placed a new piece on the chessboard, one that challenges the status quo not with force, but with fact. Why speak now? That question still lingers. Some royal commentators believe it has to do with Anne's growing sense of responsibility. With the Queen gone and King Charles facing health challenges, the pressure on the next generation is increasing. Anne, who has spent her life serving without drawing attention to herself, may have decided that the time for silence was over. Others think it may have been the Queen's documents themselves, the Windsor letters, that finally compelled Anne to speak. If she truly believed her mother's private words were being misunderstood or overlooked, it's possible she felt an obligation to clarify them, not for drama and not for political reasons, but to ensure that the Queen's personal hopes were not lost in legal technicalities. Whatever the reason, the impact is clear. Anne's statement didn't just shine a light on the Queen's preferences. It also brought emotion, memory, and humanity into a space usually dominated by protocol and procedure. It reminded people that behind the titles and traditions are real family relationships, often messy, complicated, and full of unspoken expectations. And perhaps most significantly, it reminded the world that Princess Anne, the royal often referred to as the family's quiet backbone, has her own voice. A voice shaped not by headlines or public opinion, but by duty, experience, and in this rare case, by a memory too powerful to stay hidden. As the courtroom returned to its normal rhythm and the legal discussions resumed, the emotional weight of Anne's words lingered. This wasn't just a legal hearing anymore. It had become something else entirely. A moment where personal truth, family legacy, and public responsibility all collided. To understand how unusual this moment was, it helps to consider just how disciplined Anne has been throughout her life. She's carried out thousands of royal engagements, supports over 300 charities, and is often recognized as the busiest working royal year after year. Her schedule is relentless, her focus unwavering, and she rarely shows emotion in public. That's not because she's cold or detached. It's because, like her mother before her, Anne believes the role of a royal is to serve, not to share. For her to step into a courtroom and speak candidly about her mother's private views was not just unexpected, it was completely out of character. Observers who know the inner workings of the royal family were stunned. One royal aide reportedly said, "If Anne is speaking out, something must be very wrong." That statement, while speculative, points to the gravity of the situation. Anne does not speak lightly. She is not known for making symbolic gestures or stirring public debate. So when she spoke those words in court, people paid attention. The testimony itself wasn't long, but its impact was profound. As she recalled her mother's private comments about William, Anne also introduced a new thread to the discussion, one that hadn't been publicly addressed until that moment. She shared that Queen Elizabeth had also spoken about Catherine, the Princess of Wales, in private. Anne said her mother saw something special in Catherine. Not just dignified, the Queen had said. She is steady. She is the future. That sentence seemed to change everything. Until now, Catherine had largely been seen as supportive and composed, a figure who complimented William without seeking attention for herself. But Anne's testimony reframed Catherine entirely. Suddenly, she wasn't just a wife or a duchess. She was being presented as someone the Queen herself had quietly identified as a key to the monarchy's future. It was a moment of recognition that carried immense weight, not only because it came from Anne, but because it echoed the late Queen's own judgment. Queen Elizabeth was known for being incredibly cautious with her public words. She rarely made direct statements about individuals within the family, but in private, her opinions were clear, and Anne was one of the few people she trusted with those reflections. When Anne shared her mother's view that Catherine represented something enduring, something built not on image, but on substance, it sent a powerful message. It suggested that the future of the monarchy might not rest solely on titles or traditions, but on personal strength, emotional intelligence, and the ability to serve with sincerity. King Charles's reaction to this part of the testimony was even more emotional than his earlier response. According to lip readers and court observers, He leaned toward Camilla and quietly said, "She never told me that," once again showing a side of himself rarely seen in public. His voice, reportedly cracked and soft, hinted not at anger, but at a deep sadness. Whether it was disappointment, regret, or something more complex, it was clear that Charles was hearing things he hadn't expected to hear about his mother, his son, and now his daughter-in-law. This moment of emotional vulnerability stood in stark contrast to the king's usual public image. For decades, Charles has carefully shaped his role as a modern monarch. He's spoken about climate change, architecture, interfaith dialogue, and many other issues that go beyond traditional royal duties. He's intelligent, articulate, and thoughtful. But he's also struggled at times to connect with the public in the deeply emotional way that both his mother and Diana did. Seeing him react so visibly in court made people stop and reconsider how much he's been carrying, especially in the wake of his recent health concerns and the ongoing pressure of being king in a time of immense change. Anne, meanwhile, didn't raise her voice or linger on her words. She didn't explain or justify. She simply said what needed to be said and sat back down. And in doing so, she broke a long-standing pattern, not just for herself, but for the royal family as a whole. For once, a senior royal chose to speak directly, emotionally, and publicly about matters the institution has always preferred to keep behind closed doors. What makes this even more significant is that Anne wasn't speaking out of frustration or anger. She wasn't reacting to scandal or pressure. She was speaking with intention. According to people familiar with her thinking, Anne believed that this particular moment, when her mother's documents were being reviewed and questions about the monarchy's future were rising, was the right time to step outside her usual boundaries, not to stir controversy, but to bring clarity. Her statement wasn't a challenge to the throne, and it didn't question Charles's role as king. But it did raise deeper questions about succession, legacy, and leadership. It suggested that the Queen had hopes for William and Catherine that went beyond the formal line of inheritance. Hopes rooted in empathy, steadiness, and the ability to connect with people, not just serve them. And that, perhaps, is what makes Anne's courtroom appearance so powerful. In just a few minutes, she managed to link past, present, and future in a way few others could. She brought her mother's private convictions into the light, honored Diana's emotional legacy, recognized William's readiness, and validated Catherine's quiet strength. Throughout her life, Anne has been the one who kept things moving while others paused. When the royal family faced scandals, changes, or criticism, Anne simply carried on. She visited schools, supported charities, and showed up where she was needed. She never made headlines for dramatic statements, and she rarely gave interviews. That steadiness earned her enormous respect, not just from the public, but from within the royal household. But the courtroom moment revealed something else. It showed that even the steadiest royal can reach a point where silence feels like a disservice. Anne said as much herself. "I was raised to serve, not to speak," she told the court. But silence now would be betrayal. That sentence resonated far beyond the legal proceedings. It was a reminder that even those trained to stay quiet have their limits and their convictions. The monarchy has always been defined by continuity. But continuity doesn't just mean doing the same thing forever. It also means knowing when to adapt, when to listen, and when to speak. In many ways, Anne's testimony captured that balance. She didn't abandon her principles. She honored them by choosing the right moment to reveal what she knew. Her message about Catherine marked a turning point. For years, Catherine has been praised for her grace and discretion. She has navigated intense media scrutiny, family drama, and personal challenges without complaint. But now, thanks to Anne's words, she is being seen not just as a royal consort, but as a leader in her own right. Someone the Queen believed in, someone the monarchy may depend on. Inside Buckingham Palace, those closest to the family reportedly recognized the weight of what Anne had done. While the legal proceedings were expected to focus on the Queen's private estate documents, it became something else entirely. Anne's calm but deeply personal testimony brought buried truths into the light. Truths that, until now, had existed only in quiet conversations, personal letters, and unspoken expectations. Her words weren't about disloyalty. They were about clarity. She spoke not as a critic, but as someone who has given her life to the institution. For years, Anne has been the monarchy's most dependable figure. While others have faced challenges, changed roles, or stepped back, she has continued without pause. There are thousands of photographs of Anne standing in front of community centers, opening hospitals, or shaking hands in remote towns, rarely making headlines, but always doing the work. But even for someone so used to carrying responsibility, the weight of silence eventually became too heavy. That was evident not only in her voice, but in the way she carried herself in court. Those close to her say that what the public saw was a glimpse of the personal cost behind the public role. Anne has long been known as the royal with steel in her spine, but steel, as strong as it is, can still show strain. To understand how much Anne has endured in private, you have to look beyond her official schedule and public appearances. Her personal life, though rarely in the spotlight, has been marked by its own share of difficulties. Her first marriage to Mark Phillips began with the kind of promise that royal stories often do: grand ceremony, widespread public attention, and the glow of optimism. But the cracks started to appear early, and eventually became impossible to ignore. Infidelity and emotional distance strained the relationship. The revelation that Phillips had fathered a child outside the marriage caused a quiet scandal inside the palace, even if it was mostly kept from public view at the time. But Anne didn't lash out or retreat from her duties. She didn't make public statements or seek sympathy. She simply kept going. In 1992, the divorce was finalized. That same year, she married Timothy Lawrence in a small private ceremony attended only by close family and friends. No media coverage, no crowds, just a quiet reset in the middle of a life built around public duty. Throughout those years, Anne never let her personal life interfere with her royal role. She buried her heartbreak beneath layers of professionalism. She didn't seek pity. Instead, she doubled down on her work. She became even more committed to her patronages, even more focused on staying out of the spotlight. But all of that silent resilience came at a cost. In court, as she spoke about her mother, her brother, and the future of the crown, that cost finally came into view. Her voice, though measured, carried the weight of years of internal conflict. This wasn't just about succession. It was about legacy, about loyalty, about pain carried quietly for too long. And yet, it wasn't the first time Anne had demonstrated her strength. Decades earlier, she faced one of the most dangerous moments in modern royal history, a kidnapping attempt that could have ended very differently if not for her courage. In March 1974, while returning from a charity event with her then-husband, Anne's car was forced to stop near the mall in London. A man, armed and determined, tried to pull her from the vehicle. His plan was to kidnap her and demand a ransom. Anne's response, which has since become legend, was immediate and fearless. "Not bloody likely," she said, when ordered out of the car. Those three words weren't just a refusal. They were an act of defiance, a statement of complete composure in the face of real danger. The situation was eventually brought under control, thanks to a combination of security officers and a brave passerby. But Anne's refusal to give in became a defining moment of her character. That same resolve could be seen in court, though expressed in a very different way. There were no bullets this time, no attackers, no sudden violence. But there was another kind of threat, one of silence, of unspoken tension, of unresolved truths. And once again, Anne did not back down. She stood up not just for herself, but for the monarchy as a whole, not in opposition to her brother, but out of love for the institution they both serve. In her view, the monarchy's strength has never just come from tradition or titles. It has come from service. And now, more than ever, that service must include honesty. It must reflect the values the late Queen held close: duty, empathy, and the ability to evolve. It's no coincidence that her words placed special emphasis on Catherine. In the Queen's private view, as shared by Anne, Catherine embodied qualities essential for the future of the monarchy. Calm, steady, and purpose-driven, not led by headlines, but by service. For years, Catherine has taken on an increasingly central role in royal life. She advocated for mental health awareness, visited schools, hospitals, and communities across the UK, and maintained a steady public presence despite ongoing pressures. Now, thanks to Anne's courtroom remarks, Catherine is seen through a new lens, not just as William's partner, but as a future leader in her own right. Not just the Princess of Wales, but a bridge between the monarchy's past and its future. Someone the Queen saw as capable of guiding the institution through a modern world that no longer accepts silence as strength. What comes next remains to be seen. King Charles continues to reign, but questions about his health and the pace of royal transition are becoming more frequent. William and Catherine's roles are expanding. Public sentiment is shifting, with a growing desire for a monarchy that reflects the values of today, not just the traditions of the past. Anne may never wear the crown, but in many ways, she has become its conscience. Her testimony marked a moment of reckoning, not loud, not chaotic, but deeply important. She reminded the family and the country that leadership in the modern world must be earned not only through heritage, but through heart. As the courtroom hearing concluded, there were no closing remarks from Anne. She didn't need them. Her presence, her words, and her decision to speak at all were enough. What she offered wasn't just information. It was reflection, clarity, and a challenge for the future. In the end, the monarchy is more than titles and traditions. It is a family. It is a legacy. And now, more than ever, it is a responsibility. Anne's statement that the crown must pass through William, not just by birth, but by heart, wasn't an instruction. It was a message that the values of the monarchy must be lived, not just inherited. Whether or not the institution chooses to listen remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: Princess Anne has spoken. And in doing so, she may have changed everything we thought we knew about what it means to serve the crown.